Session Blood.
Hello everyone, welcome to Session Blood episode 29.
Almost 30. What?
Yeah, 29, feeling kind of fine. So, we mentioned last week we covered the Blitz format, or actually the sort of rundown of the calling, which was in Blitz, and we wanted to circle back around to mainly Arcane Rising sealed with a little bit of team sealed at the end.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the main focus of today. Before we get into that, as always, we'd just like to do a couple of quick shout-outs. Did you want to kick things off?
Yeah, so since we're talking about Team Sealed, I want to give a massive shout-out to Henry Moore and Jesse Williams, who are my team partners for Team Sealed. They really came through and really helped, basically carried me through the event, which I'll get into later on.
Yep, and I just got a couple of shout-outs. My first one, I wanted to give a big shout-out to Reese, a.k.a. Data Doll. I think the one person repping Data Doll at the calling.
Oh, yeah.
So, mad respect from us for trying something a little bit different and just, keep on keeping on.
Yeah, and Reese managed to take out a game.
Against Brute, I think, was it as well?
Yeah.
And that
is a massive achievement.
That's a big achievement. Starting
massive shout-out to you.
3 intellect against Brute stuff, so really well done, Reese. And the other shout-out I wanted to give was to Chris Sayers and Mark the Merker Melnick, I believe he goes by. So they're from the Flesh and Blood Unsealed page on Facebook, and I know some people get a bit of a bad rep sometimes being like the evil investors, and maybe we don't always align on certain thoughts about the game, but I have noticed they've done a number of charity case breaks recently, just supporting sort of local charities around America and stuff like that, which I think is really, really cool. So big shout out to you guys, and thanks for doing the good work.
Yeah, and Unseals is just something so nice and relaxing. I don't know what it is about Unseals, but I just love kind of chucking them on in the background and seeing people crack packs. So cheers for spreading that kind of content out there.
Yeah, awesome. And now we also, before we jump in, wanted to do a Patreon giveaway today.
Yeah, so thanks to all our patrons out there. This is another one of our giveaway episodes where we have all your names here. And today, you can just double check that your name is there. And today we're giving away 12 booster packs of Arcane Rising Unlimited. And massive shout out to everyone who's supporting the channel. And if you want to get amongst some of our giveaways, you can donate as little as $3 a month to support us, and you can become part of one of these monthly giveaways. So let's shake that up a little bit.
Do you want to actually? Should I shake it up? You choose, since last time I think I chose. So I'll just shake these all up. And so that's for our sort of blue pitch and above giveaways. I think those on things. So it's
while you're shuffling up, I just want to showcase these awesome old kind of cards created by Kashan Rao, who was kind enough to actually make us real ones. So massive shout out to you. And we have all of those. He gave us a copy of each one of them that he made, so we'll be giving those out in the future as well.
All right, Cal, do you want to do the honors?
Okay. And the winner is Kirk. Massive shout out to you.
All right, congratulations, Kirk. So you've won our prize today of is it 12?
Yeah, 12 booster packs.
12 Arcane Rising booster packs.
We'll contact you for your details.
Yeah, we'll get in touch with your details and we'll get those shipped out to you.
Cool.
All right, so should we just jump right into it?
Let's do it.
Yeah, so like I said, we're going to look at Arcane Rising Sealed and then a little bit of Team Sealed towards the end. I know Arcane Rising Sealed, I'm pretty sure it's a format for some of the upcoming skirmish tournaments. I think some are welcome to Wraith.
I think most of these are going to be welcome to Wraith, but I'm sure there will be some future events, or even if you're doing some seals with your friends, this could give you some cool ideas on what to do.
Yeah, so I guess the big sort of elephant in the room is Induction Chamber.
Yeah.
So
was it before the calling we talked about how Chamber can be beaten, but I lost, basically got eliminated by 2 Chamber players, my dear friends Callum and Chris, who basically ruined my chances of top 8ing, but you managed to overcome some Chambers in top 8 with the deck that we played. That I really want to talk about, and I'm super excited about our kind of strategy going in there, which is the Runeblade pile. which is one of the funniest sealed strategies that I've ever played. It was such an amazing atmosphere having over 100 people sitting there kind of opening, kind of taking the pool and sorting out the cards and kind of looking at all the cards. And basically, through our testing, we found that if you just take all the Runeblade cards and most of the generics, if not all the generics, I mean, stuff like Prayer can be taken out depending on the matchup, where you just put them together and play like a 40 to 45 card pile, and eventually you just out fatigue any deck.
Yeah, so it's a pretty fun and when we say we tested, I mean, luckily, Carol and some of our other friends did a few sealed pools and just told me about the strategy. And I was like, okay, so I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to play the sealed. I thought I needed more time to test for the Blitz format, but then all my friends went to play sealed, so I had to go there. And yeah, that's pretty much what I did. Carol's basically explained it. I think I played 44 card Runeblade pile, so just taking all the cards, putting them all together, cutting any prayers, things like that, shuffle them up, and you're good to go.
Yeah, it's so much fun. It's all these players are just really making these decisions and what class do I play? Do I cut this card? Do I play this card? And we both just, I guess, made our piles in less than 2 minutes. Just picked them up, registered the deck, and went off to get some food.
You're good to go. Yeah. So. Well, one of the things, because Carol, mentioned that I played a couple of Induction Chambers in the Swiss before the top 8. So yeah, I ended up going 1-1 against Chamber decks, and it's I feel it's one of the matchups where, again, it is very difficult, and it does depend on your pool somewhat, but I think it can be done, but it is just hard.
Yeah.
So, but actually, maybe just stepping back slightly again to some of the before we get into the Induction Chamber one, some of the basics of the Runeblade pile. So, like we mentioned, you generally want to run everything, but it is worth checking your pool before just immediately snap committing to the strategy. So, I think some of the good cards to look out for are things like Reduce to Rune Chant, how that plays a bit of a dual role in the deck as a defense reaction, and generates rune chants for you. There's certain cards like Cadaverous Contraband, which is really good. So it's a 2-cost attack action, deals 4, 5, and 6 damage, and blocks for 2. So if that hits, you can put a non-attack action back on top of your deck. So the big thing about that card in Runeblade pile is you're playing a fatigue strategy. So it's a great 2-for-1 card, because either they block with 2 cards and you've traded 1 card for 2, or they block with 1 card, it hits, and you put a card back on top of your deck. So cards like that are really good. Things like things like Lead the Charge, Oath of the Arknight, non-attack actions that can trigger your Nebula Blade, all these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I found Vigor Rush to be insanely good, because there's a lot of these kind of any attack action that has Go Again means that you can use cards like Come to Fight, Foresight, these kind of pumps to firstly pump this attack action, so you're coming in for between 3, 5, maybe 6 damage, and then it turns on your Nebula Blade, which is the real kind of sell point of the deck, is that you're constantly trying to fatigue your opponent with that weapon hit. Yeah,
definitely. So I guess we won't get caught up too much in the card choices, because honestly I know I started that, but honestly from the testing, a lot of the time, we feel most pools can probably play that, your Runeblade pile. So generally, I feel you want to have at least sort of 40 plus cards.
Yeah, so for me, what happened in my pool was I think I had 14 Runeblade cards and then 26 generic. So I ended up with a 40 card pile, which I was like, I wish I had a few more just in those kind of fatiguey, whether it's mirror match or some, if you're versing a chamber, any more cards just helps to combat that fatigue.
Yeah, so when we're talking about these, it's more sort of fundamentals. When you're looking at your pool, sort of assessing, do you want to play the infamous Runeblade pile, or potentially if you've got a very good pool on something else, it's worth switching to that. So yeah, just some factors, things like having access to generally 2 to 3 null rune is really good. That allows you to actually compete with wizard decks, which otherwise, if you have null rune 1, it's very hard to put the pressure on. So that's a big one. Cards like Crown of Dichotomy can point you in that direction as well, because it effectively adds 2 additional cards to your deck. It does
it's really massive in like a Runeblade pile mirror.
Yeah, exactly. So things like that, like being able to have 40 plus cards, if you have all those and you look at your pool, the other classes aren't looking like particularly good, or you're struggling to build your deck, honestly, like, it's not a bad strategy. Just take all the cards, put them together, shuffle them up. And, I think I won all 3 of my Runeblade mirrors doing this thing. And, occasionally I was chatting to opponents saying, like, I didn't use these cards against you, or like, I opened my pool and it just wasn't very good, so I had to run this. And I was just thinking, like, you have to run everything. Like,
I won the match because I put them all in my deck.
Exactly. So as far as the gameplay goes on this deck, it's a lot of the time it is just about preserving a life total and blocking out damage, because a lot of your cards, you just simply don't care about them. Like, you have your like yellow, I don't know, Whisper of the Oracle or something in there, and like, sure, they can turn on Nebular, but it just blocks for 3, so
which is great. That card is amazing.
Yeah. So it's not like central to your core strategy, but it like performs a dual function of like working with this or just tossing away to block. So you just want to block out usually a lot of damage, and just identify certain turns where if you take a little bit of damage, you can hit back quite hard. With starting turns, things like, a pump spell like Come to Fight into Vigor Rush, into Nebula Blade, or, lead the charge into an attack, into a second attack, or into a Nebula Blade, things like that, because your opponent is going to have off turns during the game. So if you block out their big turns and wait for their off turns, and if you're just trading card for card, like, you got 45 cards, you're eventually going to win. Like, it feels a bit of a cheat strategy sometimes, but, just got to commit to it.
I just love the opponent's reaction when you've been playing for 15 minutes and it's quite even. You're both on that kind of like 5 life mark, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I've got like 5 cards left, and they looked over and you still have like 20, and you're just like, what is going on? And you're just like, yep, I'll just block up and attack for 1 with my Nebula.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of it's not a super complicated strategy, but I think one thing is you have to be disciplined with blocking, because like in your deck, because there might be a lot of like jank, like cards that you don't really want. Sometimes it's tempting when you draw like the good hands to just be like, oh, I'll take 6 or 7 damage here to get off my big turn. And like that isn't always wrong, depending on the context of the game state, the life totals. But like a lot of the time, you just need to be aware your core strategy is running the amount of threats. So if you're putting yourself potentially in the danger zone just to even up the life totals, or to even get 1 or 2 life ahead, that sometimes isn't worth it on this deck. I feel like often isn't worth it on this deck, because
absolutely,
you have a lot of cards that block for 2 because you have generics, so you don't want to put yourself in a position where like you could have run them out of cards, but instead, because you're on like 3 or 4 life and they've still got 10 cards left in their deck or 12 cards left in their deck, they just have this big turn and then you lose, and you're thinking like, oh, if I had 3 or 4 more life. So I think it's just like small amounts of chip damage consistently.
Just slow and steady.
So just like, small consistent chip damage with the occasional like big turn sprinkled in. And like eventually you just tend to get there.
And I feel like it's really nice to keep in mind too, with cards like Cadaverous Contraband, Rifting, your Amplify the Arknights. Those are kind of like the big hits that it's quite worth it to even slap it down in Arsenal or block with 2 cards and play it out, because at the end of the day, if you're attacking them for between 4 to 6 damage and they use 2 cards to block that damage, you're trading 2 for 1. So it's always good to pay attention to how many cards out of the deck you're actually using and how many does it take for them to block up that damage, because those 2 for 1s with an insane amount of cards in your deck does add up to that fatigue strategy working well. Yeah,
and generally I find, at least in my games, I wanted to go first. You're the same, just and there's no like deep thought process to that. It's more like if I go first and I draw something that hits for 5 or 6 damage, I just like immediately run it out and say, okay, I've traded 1 card for 2, like 1 more card up. Always, like we said last time, always count your opponent's deck before the game starts, because you, and actually during the game as well, because you don't want to be in a position where, like, you know, you might be playing against a similar strategy, or you're just always blocking out 2-for-1 thinking you're going to win, and then they've got a few more cards and then, like, you're in a bad spot. But yeah, I think generally it's just block up, trade your big cards for that, like, you know, run out your attacks that can trade 2-for-1, and yeah, that's pretty much it, I feel, right?
Yeah. I actually try to be a bit more cheeky during my kind of mirror games and games where the deck size really mattered, was when I didn't want to ask my opponent about how many cards they have, because I didn't want to make them aware of what I'm doing. So what I tried to do is kind of judge at which point their graveyard kind of reached their deck size. Same thing for me. If I was like paying attention to that, I'm like, oh, they're gonna mill out quicker than I will, so this strategy is working. Whereas it's fine to do it kind of midway through a game where it doesn't matter if your opponent realizes, because it could be too late. But I did kind of want to kind of like keep it on the dealer.
That's true, because there is a downside. Like, if you count their deck before the game starts, then like naturally they're probably going to do the same back, and then they see you're running 45 cards and know they have to like adjust their gameplay. So I suppose there is a downside to doing that. I mean, on another level as well, like Carol was saying, if you can actually sort of judge their, like, roughly their graveyard size relative to their deck, you know, a funny little like angle, like not illegal I don't think, but a funny little like strategy you can take rather than counting through their whole deck. Like, you know, if you see it sort of half and half ideally, or like 2/3 to 1/3 of your graveyard, you kind of have
can I have a look at your graveyard?
Can I have a look at your graveyard, please? And you're kind of, you know, you're looking through for cards, but you're just sort of, you know, if you count, there's 16 cards in their graveyard and it's about even with their deck, well, I guess they have 16 cards left. Like, So just little things that, like, honestly, they probably don't have a huge impact on the game, but it's just like something that, you know, it's legal to do, and why not do it?
Yeah, another thing about this strategy that I wanted to point out is you still want to kind of keep in mind these core kind of like key cards. Things like your red come to fight, or like a yellow lead the charge. Those are kind of like enablers that can pair up quite nicely with other cards. Like when I was open my pool, I was really stoked to see Arcane Ascendancy, which is, you know, kind of like a big bomb for the class. It's one of these things that in a format where there are defense reactions, but there aren't too many. You know, the Runeblade and Wizard, those are rares, so they aren't as common. You have the Fateful Scenes and whatnot, but a lot of the time that Dominate is quite powerful. So I've noticed that I had a red come to fight and a Arcane Ascendancy, and I was like, oh, this is a pretty cool kind of pair of cards that I can slap one in Arsenal and then wait for the other. But then I also had a red Foresight.
Oh, yep.
And one of my equipments was Braces of Belief. And after the first game, I realized that those three cards, the red Foresight, the Arcane Ascendancy, and Braces, work really nicely together, because if I put the Foresight in my arsenal, wait till I draw my Ascendancy, and then play the Foresight, I can actually set up the Braces.
Yeah.
Because the Opt 2 allows me to make sure that there's a red on top, so that will make the Braces give +2, and then Ascendancy comes in for 10. And that was a big kind of sub-strategy other than Fatigue that I was trying to run. So basically, I actively pitched those. I pitched the the Foresight and the Ascendancy together. We'll try to make them together, and then some reds as well to enable the Braces, and then wait for a turn late game where that 10 Dominate is really impactful. And that's how I actually won all the games that I did win. Yeah,
because Brace of Belief, it's just the arm slots equipment, so you can destroy it, then you reveal the top card of your library, and your attack gets 3 minus the pitch cost of that. Yep. So, you know, you don't want to use that on a blue, because then you've done it for nothing, whereas in a red +2 is really impactful. And little side note, if you have no cards in your deck, it gets +3.
Yeah. So actually, that's a good point. That's something that we found, me and Callum, when we played our games, was that a Ravenous Rabble, even a blue one, isn't necessarily that bad, because if you're in a Fatigue mirror and you have things like Braces of Belief or Ravenous Rabbles, then you can create a turn where at the end you kind of draw your 2 Rabbles and you have Abrasers, and those are your last cards. And those blue Rabbles hit for 3. If you have yellows, they hit for 4, and the red ones would hit for 5, and the bracers will give you +3. So it's kind of like a nice little finisher for those fatigue mirrors.
Yeah, a poor man's last ditch. We like to call Rabble. But it's true. Yeah. So, and I think that sort of when you were talking about your combo as it was with your pump and your Arcane Ascendancy, that so I think ties in nicely to the idea of as well that you do want to pay attention to cards like that you are pitching during the game. Not even so much like definitely for pitch order, but also just like a simple decision. Like if on your turn you're not able to use up your whole hand, or if you're blocking, you don't want to just like blindly block out with impactful cards, or maybe like not pitch your impactful cards, because like well sometimes you might be okay thinking like if I got a card in Arsenal, I can use up 3 cards. I don't mind keeping like say the lead the charge in hand, something like that, or a counter fight. Often you might want to consider if it's actually better like pitching those away. So if they have a big turn, you're not forced to block with it, because like the whole thing about this deck is like eventually they're going to come back. Eventually they're eventually going to use these cards, and you're going to use them to deal damage. So like it is worth, because you've got like your ratio of actual good cards to bad cards is like not that good because you've got a lot of bad cards in your deck. It is worth like in certain situations, if you can, just maybe looking ahead to where the game is eventually going and thinking like, I just want to safely put this card on the bottom of my deck so I can use it at a later point.
Yeah, so kind of like keep in mind that you want to block with those bad ones and do save those kind of like threats for later, because if you're playing defensively, chances are that you will draw those cards back.
Absolutely, and you want to keep that in mind. Like even cards like Carol mentioned, Arcane Ascendancy, for example, like it's probably a card, like sometimes there's positions where it's not actually worth putting a card in Arsenal. Like if, like ideally you want to pitch that away, or if you, for some reason you can't pitch it, or whatever reason, you don't actually want to like just put that in Arsenal, because that's more of a mid to late game card. So you put yourself in a position where it's either stuck in Arsenal for like 5 or 6 turns, or otherwise you're forced to like just run it out at not a good time. So that is another thing to keep a factor of, because like, well, the gameplay is relatively simple. It is easy to like slip up and put yourself in a spot where not only are you playing this like slow, not super strong on a turn by turn basis deck, but also you're playing with a 4-card hand rather than potentially 5 the whole time. That another small thing is if you're playing with things like Reduce to Rune Chant, because I like got caught out by this once or twice during the day, is just really be aware of the way you're structuring your turn. If there's a way to end up with a Rune Chant in play, like you really want to do that. Like honestly, it's better to sort of be able to generate a Rune Chant and not deal 2 damage in order to like stop their big turn, particularly if you feel like you've been paying attention to pitch order, they've got threats, or they haven't really played any big threats and you're going to need it. Reduce the Rune Chant without a Rune Chant in play is really
reduced.
Yeah, it's very much
in value.
It's very much reduced in power, because that means that you have to pitch a card to play this defense reaction. So like you're not blocking with 5 cards now, you're still blocking with 4 cards. That might be a like reasonably basic point, but just it's like, do I play this Amplify the Arc Knight to red to get in 6 damage, or do I just instead pitch it to play a Spellblade Strike? And if you got the Reduce the Rune Chant in play, like you want to play the Spellblade Strike, that kind of thing.
I see.
So I guess those are like the fundamentals of the deck. I know you mentioned before you had a point about defense reactions, or was that more related to the Induction Chamber deck?
Yeah, I was more to, because what happened, and if you want to check out kind of my tournament report for that one, I wrote an article on Channel Fireball that kind of details my games. But basically, I won my first 2 games, and then the third game I versed Callum, one of our teammates, who opened a chamber, and that was just a thrashing. Basically, not only was I making little misplays here and there, he was playing very like a very conservative, very efficient game, where he was kind of basically blocking everything that I was trying to do a lot better than I was. And of course, with the chambers, he was able to get a lot more value out of his turns. And I just got completely smashed. But one of the things that I've learned from that game was that Basically, I was like, I went second and I drew a defense reaction. I drew a red Fate for scene. I was like, oh, this is going to be nice, soak up quite a bit of damage once Callum puts some pressure on me. And of course, Callum went in the strategy of just kind of blocking up my attacks and pitching away with the pistols. And that red Fate for scene, even though it's a really good card, it didn't help me for at least 3 or 4. It wasn't until turn 3 or 4 that I could get some decent value out of it. And that made me realize that in this matchup, you really want to create strong 5-card hands, which is those 4 cards you draw, and 5th is Arsenal. So I found that really impactful, the non-attack actions that we talked about, like lead the charge, come to fight, maybe even Whisper of Oracle that kind of turns on your Rune Chant production or Nebula Blade. Those are the kind of cards that you want to slap down an arsenal and wait to draw 4 cards that are quite impactful. So you could take something like the 2 pistol hits, drop down 4 life, but be able to put so much more pressure back on your turn that you're actually putting some kind of pressure so that your opponent is either leaking Rune Chant damage, using their whole hand to block, which kind of opens up, gives you that window where you can put on more pressure on your next turn. So I definitely found that those are kind of the cards to keep in mind.
Yeah, so I suppose moving on to looking at Induction Chamber a bit, since it was like the big sort of factor on the day. And I think we'll get around to looking a little bit at Wizard and Ranger as well in this episode, but we feel Induction Chamber... So, yeah, we were saying, like you mentioned, we were saying last week that it's a very good card, but we feel like there are solutions in the format, and people may be able to play around it. I feel ultimately we may have been proven a little bit wrong by the results. So, I'm not sure if we said last time, but based on the number of players, we're expecting, like, sort of 7 to 8 chambers to be opened. That's just like doing the math of like how many super rares in the set, like divided by number of packs opened and divided by 6 or all that sort of thing. So there were 8 chamber decks and 6 of them made top 8.
Yeah, and I feel like it just makes your deck so consistent and so hard to, and it's very punishing if you do misplay. So I think that's definitely a factor where the chamber deck is able to just constantly put pressure. You know, you're chipping away with the pistols, you're blocking up, you're fatiguing your opponent while kind of stopping them being able to do much because they're kind of blocking to prevent just basically losing life.
Yeah, I still think though it is one of those strategies that, like, and again we're not going to argue that Chamber's a bad card by any things, because I think even a couple of weeks back we were saying it is a very powerful card, but I think strategies like that become even stronger in like an Arcane Rising sealed format. I feel a lot of, like, you know, we hadn't done a ton of testing for it. I feel a lot of people turning up had put a lot of their focus into Blitz and not so much Arcane Rising sealed, since Blitz was the the calling format. It's one of those strategies that, like, it's, if you haven't put a lot of time into Arcane Rising sealed, it is quite hard to deal with. And like, I include myself very much in that category, because it's just a strategy that can basically, if you're playing out like just like a normal game of Flesh and Blood, and unless you have like some elaborate setup or you're doing all these things, like the consistent value of it makes it very hard to play around. So, like, my experience playing against Chamber Dash, so I went 1-on-1 against it. I lost my first game to Ash, one of our local Auckland player. It was a very good fab player, so shout out Ash. But I actually felt that game was very close. So we both got down to like very low life totals, very low sort of cards in deck kind of thing. I think I was just running a few more cards than he was, so I thought there was a chance I could actually maybe get it to that grind out stage where I can force out the last few cards from his hand. Because I think he was down to like 0 or 1 card in deck and like a hand, and I was like somewhat similar. I think against these decks, it like that's when you definitely need to take a long view of the game when you're playing Runeblade. I think it's very important to block out a number of those chamber hits in order to keep your life total up, while still keeping an eye on like the size of each player's deck to make sure you're not just like giving them infinite value. I think another big thing in that matchup is it's like very, very important, as I think you alluded to identify your big turns and the turns that are going to get through damage. because against this deck that they have a somewhat similar strategy to you a lot of the time, I think, where they're just like, well, if we trade card for card, eventually I'm going to win on value because then I can just shoot you for 2+2 every turn. So sometimes like you need to be disciplined in the turns that you're going to take damage. But if you do get a big window where you can like strip their hand and also most likely get through 3, 4, 5 damage, I think you actually need to take that because. Yeah, if you trade card for card and you've got even life totals all the way through, like they're very happy with that game state because I think eventually, if you both run out of card, like if you've got 5 cards left in your deck and they've got like 0, but you're both on 16 life, like it gets to the point where you just cannot kill them because like they're just gonna go like attack with chamber over and over again
and just take your hits
and eventually like. They probably, like maybe that's not the best example, but if it's a point where like you cannot threaten lethal damage and they can just chip you away, they are going to be able to kill you. Again though, the game that I won against Dash was against another one of my friends, Chris. Unfortunately had to play him where he was boosting quite a bit. He definitely got like a bit unlucky on some of those boosts. I think he missed like 4 or 5 boosts in a row, which definitely put him behind on cards and deck and let me like play to my strategy a bit. But I do think for Dash players, if they are running something like 30 to 35 cards, and you do see them like actually boosting away cards a fair bit, then you can adapt to a more defensive strategy and even potentially grind them out through their Induction Chamber. Because one thing to note about the chamber is that a lot of the time players use it in the sense like they shoot for 2 with Go Again and then play an attack. So they're not it's not like they're coming for 2+2 every single turn. So if you're aware of that, sometimes it can be fine. Like you might just take the chamber hit and block out their second attack if you've got the big hand and still come through and put them under pressure. And then like you just sort of look what patterns are in their gameplay. If they're relying on just 2+2 damage every single turn and pitching all their threats to the bottom, like you can try keep an eye on their pitch order. You can try and make sure that like you're preserving these 5-card hands to put them under pressure to strip out cards. Because at the end of the day, if you're like consistently getting 2-for-1s in terms of like cards left in your deck, you can pressure them to a point where like they start to run low on cards in library, and you still have like a significant advantage in terms of how many cards in your deck that you are able to pressure them out. You can be like in a spot where like, well, now you're being actually forced to block this out, and once you run out of cards, I can threaten lethal. Like your 2+2 isn't going to be enough.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to mention is if the Dash player does want to, if they do want to keep their the deck high in number of cards, then chances are that they will run items, which I've noticed a lot in those kind of Dash games on the top tables. Is when it got to that late game stage, these Dash players would draw hands with 2 to 3, sometimes even 4 items, and they were just unable to block damage at the end, which is really interesting to see because if you're pitching something like the
Optical
monocle, or you pitch if they don't run out those items throughout the game, that means that at the end they're quite vulnerable to not being able to block. Which can just be quite easy to blow them out. And if they do want to run out the items, then you're just happy because it relieves pressure from you on, if they go like pistol, you take 2, and then they drop something like a conviction amplifier or something like that. Then you're just like, oh wow, well I have a window right now.
Yep, and I think just blocking out damage is like I said, is really, really important, even in the early to mid game where it might not matter so much. I feel in my game against Ash, it was interesting because in like the early to mid or so game, at one point I feel I got a little bit greedy, so I wanted to keep like one card over another card. So instead of blocking out this attack with a 3 block, I instead blocked it with a 2 block card. I took 1 damage, and the thing is, as soon as that happened, I did it, and I looked at him and said, I think that was like, I probably shouldn't have said this because we committed a game, but I was playing against Ash, she's my buddy. I looked at him and I said, I feel that's a mistake and I'm going to regret that later in the game. And I mean, you can't just like say because of that the game, like I would have won, because obviously the game would have played out differently. But what like it really, I felt, bit me towards the end of the game. And again, with all the factors, blah, 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 things might have changed. But there was a point where I dropped down to 2 life instead of 3. And that is like very critical against Dash, because if you're on 3 life it means if they attack you for 2+2, you only have to block with 1 card. Whereas if you're on 2, you have to block every single Induction Chamber hit. And it's really, really relevant because when both players are getting low on cards, as Carol mentioned, when players are down to items, if you are able to preserve a 3-card hand and go down to 1 life, there might be a spot where you can actually straight up just like have a turn where you strip 3 cards from their hand. And then, they might be at a point where they're actually running out of cards in the deck at this point. So if you strip 3 cards from their hand, they shoot you back for 2+2, you block with 2 cards, then you can actually get rid of the last remaining cards in their deck or leave them with cards that can't block. So these are all things to like take into account when playing against Chamber. Again, it is a very difficult deck to beat, particularly if the player like has had some experience maybe constructed playing with dash control, dash mid-range, and they really understand at a deep level like how this card advantage and value works. But if you're playing at someone who is potentially like not so in tune with that, or they might present like a 31, 32 card deck with Chamber and you've got 45, like don't just give up. Like you should know that like you do have a chance to win this game. You're going to have to play it really well, and it's very unforgiving, but you can win these games.
Definitely. And with other classes, in terms of dealing with Chamber, I wanted to give a massive shout out to Antonio, who is our testing partner and friend from way back, who actually who introduced us to the Runeblade pile. And he decided to play Ranger at this event, and he ended up having like a 45 or 46 card Ranger, and he was actually tearing through the field. He was basically running Ranger pile that was actually fatiguing people out, which was crazy to see. This hero without an attacking weapon actually fatiguing people, which was really cool to see. But we've found that with Ranger in particular, the one way that you can kind of go into late game against a deck like Dash is to utilize Salvage Shot. So Salvage Shot is a key piece to the puzzle, in where in the very late stage of the game, if you do kind of get in the situation where your opponent is putting pressure with pistols, you're shooting them back with arrows, it's kind of evenish. You have the ability to, with kind of, once you draw your final hand, you can salvage shot, put a salvage shot with Death Dealer, use Azalea's ability, so you're basically putting that salvage shot from your arsenal on the bottom of your deck, and that is the card that you put from the top of your deck. So you're basically just giving it dominate over and over again. Yeah,
because just to explain that again. So yeah, basically Azalea's ability, it's in 2 parts. So if you've got no cards in library, it's an arsenal. Arsenal card goes into the deck, then it checks what cards in the deck, puts it up face up into arsenal, and salvage shot, just to explain that card as well, like if it hits, it goes back into your library. So that's kind of like the recursion that you're looking at setting up.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of way to constantly dominate damage, and all it takes is your opponent not having a defense reaction in arsenal to create that loop and kind of get some value out of that.
Definitely, because that's the thing. When people are looking at, like, if your opponent's on the other side looking at Ranger versus Dash, you think Ranger doesn't have a weapon. So eventually, if you're keeping your life total high and the Dash player is playing to a point where I'll just run them out of cards in deck, and then so like they don't care if you're on 10 or 12 or 14 life sometimes, because they say like, well, eventually I just win with Chamber. So this strategy won't always work in a close game because like you are forced to block with cards. But if you keep your life total high and you're aware of this potential like late game strategy, you can catch a player off guard. Because like we say, like if they're thinking, well, okay, cool, they're on 12 life, I'm on like 5, doesn't matter, like no, I win the game, and then you're like salvage shot with dominate, hit you for 2 dominated damage, rinse and repeat over and over again. So if you put yourself in a position where you're able to take a few chamber hits and then just like deal the final few points of damage with that salvage shot, that's definitely one way of sort of counteracting that deck.
Yeah, I mean, it's still super hard to pull off just purely because of the pressure that chamber puts on you. But that is, it's great to, it's just good to be aware of this interaction between Azalea, hero ability, and salvage shot, and that you can constantly get that dominated arrow going.
Yeah, because that's one I actually wasn't aware of, like as well, until because I don't play a whole lot of Ranger, and then someone in like a group chat mentioned this to me, and I was like, oh, that's really cool.
Yeah. And then I guess for Wizard is...
I'm just going to say, briefly looking back at Ranger as well, because like we say, that's a bit of like a pocket strategy. It can work, like, we know it's not always going to come up, like you can't rely on that to win the game. But when you mention Antonio's sort of Ranger pile, so where you have like 46 cards, I think one thing about Ranger to keep in mind is like, if you have a number of red arrows, you can look at these like not even as dealing damage, but just as trading 2-for-1 cards over and over again. So if you want to play like almost like, I don't know if Ranger Control is the correct term, or like a mid-range Ranger to like bring it into late game, if you have enough cards in your deck, you do need a certain number of arrows to make the strategy work.
Definitely.
And definitely you probably want like a yellow or red salvage shot in there, like ideally multiples.
Yeah.
But if you're able to do this, like play to a game where like you're controlling the tempo and you're like writing out your attacks, and I'm like, okay, I attack like with go again, then I attack for 5 or 6 with an arrow, and then on your off turns you're just blocking out damage. Like, again, I think players really fall into that mindset. I've done this before of like Ranger, it's all good, I just get to the end game and I win. But particularly as well, if you're playing 46 cards, they're playing like 35ish or something, you can definitely get around that, because like if you just consistently trade 1 card for 2, like it's just...
Yeah, those red head shots, red hamstring shots, all those cards, when you shoot them out, they're like, oh, I'll try and preserve my life and block with 2 cards. Those are just those 2-for-1s that we're talking about.
Yeah, because even stuff like Searing Shot, Ridge Rider Shot, the red ones, like if they block with 1 card, they leak 1 damage. So you can, like, and particularly with Azalea, like we mentioned, for like stacking your deck in terms of like pitching to set up combos, really, really important, because, you know, you can set up dominated arrows with Azalea. You can set up turns where you're able to play like pump spells like Come to Fight or Foresight on top of a dominated arrow. So these can be the turns where you get damage through to put pressure on, so they can't just like ignore your blocks to preserve their cards in deck. But you want to push towards a game state where like you're forcing out blocks, you're controlling the tempo, they're thinking it's just Ranger, and then it comes to a point where they have like 8 cards left in library and you might have like 14 or 15. And that's the point where, like, if you've been like running through all these strategies, it can actually start, you know, they start to sweat a little bit, being like, how am I going to kill this Ranger player? Like, they're going to get me.
And that's a good point about those pumps, like Come to Fights or Take Aims. One of the strategies you can implement is shoot out those arrows, and actually you could actively focus on shooting out those kind of not the best arrows, something like yellow headshots that still put pressure, but it's a yellow card, and you actually actively try to get rid of the kind of yellow, or even if you have blue cards out, you still want to keep pressure with, you know, the odd kind of like red hit. But if you're actively pitching these pumps to the bottom of your deck, then you can create situations where you draw hands that are kind of like, you know, one Come to Fight, 1 Take Aim, and 1 arrow. Or basically, if you pay attention to stacking the deck, you can start shooting, save those pumps for very late game, where those dominated arrows are actually a lot more punishing. So shooting an arrow for 11 dominate on turn 1 compared to turn 15, it's a huge difference. You know, if your opponent's on 5 life, a lot of the time it will just kill them. But if they're on 20 life, then they're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll block and take a bunch of damage. Yeah,
because then like it's sort of based on information. At the start of the game, if like, okay, I'm starting this game on 13 life, then I play it differently. Whereas like you're playing throughout the game, and like maybe they're paying attention, maybe they're not. Like, I mean, I'm not the best at always at paying attention to what people pitch, so I'm just like, oh, the game's going fine, bam, I'm dead. Like,
yeah, and the chances are it's a lot less likely for them to have a big defense reaction in Arsenal. If you've been paying attention to what they're pitching. I mean, if they haven't been pitching something like Red Fate for scenes, and while you're pitching your pumps, then roughly when you draw those, you'll know that they probably won't have a defense reaction unless they've saved it for a number of turns. But yeah, basically, those are the kind of things to keep in mind when playing Ranger and Limited.
Yeah, and just stuff like Fate for Scene, like all colors are pretty good, because like they can act as defense reactions. Also Opt, which is like really helpful for just setting up turns in the mid game even. I just randomly get through 2 or 3 damage with Dominated Arrow. Like, it's quite good. And like any form of red defense react, I feel is like sometimes like it's pretty decent in Ranger, because like you have it sitting there, and then you can either, if you need to, like use it if you block out a 4 power spell or 4 damage or even 4 damage plus attack. With this, you're getting value because you're blocking the 4, and if you don't, you can always Azalea it to the bottom if you really need to. So. Yeah, I suppose a lot of little things for Ranger, but I think Ranger can be quite good in sealed. It's just definitely probably takes a bit of time and practice and maybe a decent pool, but it can get there.
Yeah.
But I suppose, anyway, you're moving on to Wizard, like you were saying.
So, I mean, Wizard obviously has a completely different game plan against... when you're versing Wizard, you have a different game plan. So when it comes to Dash and Chamber, there's... One of the kind of Achilles' heels could be the fact that they don't have null runes.
Yep.
And kind of chipping away with pistols puts pressure, but a deck like Wizard can actually use it to their advantage because you can actively just pitch away your cards to cast spells or to activate your Crucible of Aetherweave or Kano ability, and basically it gives you a lot of room to create those powerful late game combos. So if throughout the early game you're pitching blues to, I don't know, put out some kind of cast some spells or attack with things like Riftings or your Cadaverous Contrabands, and you have those 4 reds, and then you actively start pitching things like red Aether Flares, Stir the Aether Winds, those powerful non-attack actions that Wizard has, you can actually get in a situation where at the very end of the game, you can punish your opponent, even if they do have null runes, to create really powerful spell combinations to deal crazy damage.
Yeah, because there's a lot of little combos in Wizard. Things like Aether Flare is a really good example. So, you know, if it deals damage, it kind of adds that much to your next Wizard non-attack action. But I think that's a good point because, yeah, against Dash, if you're playing Chamber Dash and you've got 1 null rune, which it isn't like, you know, sometimes it just happens, like, you know, you didn't open the correct equipments, then if you're playing on Wizard, that's like a very winnable matchup.
Yeah, because you go block, even if they attack with pistol, then a big attack, you can take the pistol for 2, drop 2 life, use the other 2 cards to block a big attack, and then you have 2 cards to go pitch Voltic Bolt, pitch
Scalding Rain or something.
Scalding Rain, yeah. And then they're actually on a bigger clock than you are.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, you should be aware that, like, players, if you reveal Wizard, they probably will sideboard out, like, a number of cards. Maybe they play closer to 30, or, you know, just a few more. So, like, their deck will be a bit more refined. They might have, like, and also a bit of an aggro strategy they want to play. But in saying that, you know, if they're playing an aggro strategy, you can still just play it in a similar way. And if they start boosting away cards, it runs them low on threats in their deck. But yeah, playing Wizard, even if they have null rune, you can certainly play towards a game state where you're setting up just like, and the more cards you go through in your deck, the easier it becomes to keep track of it as well. So when you're, and like at certain points, if you are aware of what's in your deck and what isn't, you might take damage in order to preserve a card like a red Aether Flare or a red Voltic Bolt, so you can set it up for the late game. But you can really just get them in a position where you're like pitching away, life totals are kind of close, and then, you know, they go in for what they think is lethal damage, and you just respond by flipping over like a red Aether Flare or Reverberate or something into like a Voltic Bolt, into a few other things, and you just throw out 9 to 10 damage from nowhere that they generally can't prevent. Like, there's not a whole lot of prayers in the format, so it's just based on Irene's prayer, so it's just based on null runes, and then the game's over. So, like, Chamber Dash, it's always going to be a good deck in the format, but I think ideally as, you know, Arcane Rising sealed, I suppose, like, there'll be a few more tournaments, I guess. So I suppose we move on to Monarchs, it becomes less relevant. So maybe people aren't practicing that a whole lot, but I think if you're aware of these side strategies, it shouldn't be that, like,
that you automatically lose.
Yeah, it shouldn't be that, like, an Induction Chamber opened with an otherwise not particularly good seal pool should always beat any other deck. Like, that should simply not be the case, and I don't think it is. It is difficult to play around, but, like, basically we just want to throw out some strategies. Well, recognizing it is very strong, and it probably is going to win a lot of games. We just want to give you some advice and some strategies to potentially help counteract that.
Yeah.
So you don't sit down and I know it sucks. Like you get paired up with someone, you sit down, you're like, oh no, chamber dash. Like, but it is a bit of a hill to climb, but you can beat these decks.
Yeah, and talking about people who did just that is Cale McCreath, who ultimately won the whole thing. He managed to get Kieran in the finals, but he was playing Dash without a chamber, and the way that he managed to get an edge against these other Dash control, these other Dash decks, was that he set up one of his own combos, which he said that was really worked really well in practice, which he had the cognition nodes, which is an item that he started and play with, that basically if cognition nodes has a counter on it, and you put a counter on it by paying some resources, and an attack action hits, you can remove the counter and put that attack action on the bottom of your deck. And he paired that up with Cadaverous Contraband, and Cadaverous Contraband gets back a non-attack action when it hits and puts it on top of your deck. And then throughout the game, he would play the Conviction Amplifier.
Conviction Amplifier.
And Conviction Amplifier gives your next attack Dominate. So basically,
that's an item as well.
Yeah. So basically, the way it works is with counters on both those items, he would give his Cadaverous Contraband Dominate, attack for 6. The opponent blocks for 3, takes 3. The Conviction Amplifier, if it's dead or if he's got one in the graveyard, goes on top, so he draws that back, and then Nodes puts the Cadaverous Contraband back on the bottom. So in a very late game scenario, he basically keeps on recurring these cards together to keep on whacking your opponent for 3.
Yeah, and that's the thing as well. We haven't really covered Dash apart from saying Induction Chamber Dash. I guess because that's like the big boogeyman in Sealed. But that's the thing. Like if you can play a Dash Sealed pool without necessarily having to like have Chamber. It's not just like a dead class. Like I don't have Chamber. It's hopeless. It is based a little bit around this item. So if you have things like Cognition Nodes or Conviction Amplifier, like that really helps it. Because the problem is if you're playing a very boost heavy Dash deck and like I'm just going to play 30 cards and go for it, your opponent like knows this and they can just block out, like unless your deck is incredible, they can often just like block out every single boost attack until you run out of cards. So, but you can play Dash without Chamber.
I've seen quite a few players have some success with it. I played one opponent who didn't boost pretty much the whole game, but they did a great job at basically creating these big attacks, things like come to fight into like a big throttle, backed up. They would back it up with something like an optical monocle, so they would only boost at it when they knew that they had a mech card on top, or pair that up with something like that amplifier that gives the attack Dominate, so then all of a sudden you're getting attacked with 9 Dominate, and kind of create those situations where you get a lot of value from that. There was one turn where I kind of was comfortable, I was like playing my Runeblade pile, I was like, I'm just going to block everything, and all of a sudden they go red plunder run, give my next attack Dominate, player come to fight, and then throttle me for 11 with no boost, and I'm just like, oh man, like
yeah, cause
that's a lot of damage.
And in this sort of format as well, like you can say block out damage, but there are turns where you just have to take damage. And like if you're playing towards a game state, like your opponent gets down to 9 or 10, but they're feeling kind of comfortable, like you can, like in a format where like top card of your deck matters so much, it really lends itself to like looking ahead and setting up these game states. Like we talk about like deck stacks with Ranger and Wizard, even Runeblade, but you can do the same sort of idea on Dash. So like you basically maybe you don't have to do it from the start of the game, but if you just keep it in mind, and then towards the middle of the game, you're setting up these turns where like you've pitched away 2 or 3 red or yellow boost cards, and then you know that when it gets towards the late game, you've got this turn where you're like, okay, well, I can boost, and I know I'm going to hit 3 times in a row, so I'm just going to go boost, boost, boost. Even if you block with your whole hand, I'm getting through maybe like 5 or 6 or 7 damage here, which might just be enough to win the game. Or get it to a point where you've stripped so many cards and it's gone kind of towards the late game where now they have to block your pistol for 2 every turn. And like that might be like just enough to get you there.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think all the decks are, I suppose, summing up Arcane Rising Sealed. I feel like all the decks are viable. Some, I feel like things like Ranger and Wizard might be a little bit harder to play. But we're hoping with like some of these strategies and ideas we've given you, and the thing is like we're not like absolute authorities or experts on the format, but just from what we've picked up, we're hoping some of these things might, like, when you look at your sealed pool, you might take a second look and say like, oh, like maybe I could run with this, or like, or these combos can work, or
yeah, definitely. I found it to be an incredibly fun format.
I love it.
There's so many cool card interactions that you can base your whole kind of strategy around. You know, like the Conviction Amplifier, Cadaverous Contraband. There's so many interactions like that with multiple classes that I feel like it's a really fun format.
And that's the thing, and sort of I guess a side note on Chamber, whereas like we know it's really good, but I suppose this doesn't really impact on the power of the card. But in a way, if you're playing, like, this was a 107 person tournament, like if you're playing a tournament maybe, you know, online, or if your COVID restrictions allow, potentially in person even, if you have like 50 to 60 people, there might be like 3 or 4 chambers, if that. And so even if that happens, like, they're not guaranteed to make, like, to just win through and make the top 8 or even win the whole tournament. Like, you know, maybe 2 chamber decks make it through, but maybe they get beaten out. But basically what it's saying is like, when you're playing the format, don't just like laser focus and be like, oh, well, someone open chamber, like they're going to win the whole tournament. Because a lot of these things, well, if it gets to the top 8, it goes down to a draft, so it's totally different again. But yeah, I feel my final advice would be, if you open your pool and you're just like completely lost and you've registered and you're running out of time, take all the Runeblade cards, take all the generics, shuffle them up, and you're probably good to go.
Yeah, and it's a really fun deck to play.
And okay, I feel we've probably ended up speaking a little bit longer than sealed than we might have thought. As we do this every time we get sort of really interested in something, and time runs away from us a bit. In saying that, should we potentially just have a look at Team Sealed maybe next time?
Well, we'll have a look at it in the next week's podcast, but yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah, because it's a really fun format, but we just don't want to overwhelm people with these like super long podcasts. I guess that's it from us. Next week we'll be covering, like we mentioned, probably a little bit of Team Sealed, and then some new topics that we think up of, or that we've got in the vault. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll probably have a look at kind of the skirmish events coming up and talk about how to strategize for that.
Some thoughts on the Blitz meta game, that kind of thing going forward. Yep, but thank you for tuning in and sticking with us, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, see you next week.
See you next week.